you being here. Always encouraging. Like Russ said, happy Mother's Day. And we're thankful that you're here. And we apologize for the projector not being here. It's here physically, but not mentally. It's just not quite clicking on all cylinders. But I hope you have your Bibles anyway. And you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're looking this month at the relationships within the crown, within the body of Christ. And we looked last week at verses 1 and 2 in our diverse relationships with one another, how we treat and how we interact with one another. And verse 3 begins a somewhat lengthy section on widows. So this morning lessons, as you cannot see on the screen, is taking care of mom. I thought it was appropriate and perhaps even the providence of God that we arrived at this particular chapter, this particular section on this particular day. Because most of us, obviously not all of us, but most of us will get to a point in time, if we haven't gotten there already, where we need to take care of mom or dad. And I think it's particularly fitting on Mother's Day because most of the time we think about, on this day, we think about pampering mom. We think about being grateful for mom. And we think about perhaps even future moms or new moms. The passage that Clay read for us talked about old moms. Nobody wants to be called old, especially a woman. But there comes a point in time when we got to take care of our old mama. We got to take care of the woman that took care of us for so long. In this passage, we'll go ahead and read it. We see a description of how we ought to and how we ought not to take care of our mothers as Christians. Honor widows who are truly widows, verse 3. But verse 4, if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead, even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that you may be without reproach. Verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Two things, 2 points. You see the approved way in verse 4. The approved way of taking care of mom. And then at verse 8, as this particular section comes to a close, you see the disapproved way of taking care of mom, what you ought not to do. Direct your attention to verse 4 as we begin and dive into this, because in verse 4, you see a threefold approach. Threefold requirements for doing what is necessary in order to take care of mom. If you call yourself a Christian, you cannot neglect your mama. The first aspect of this in verse 4 is that in order to take care of mom, you must look at what it says. Let them, children and grandchildren, because sometimes it falls on grandchildren. Let them first learn to show godliness. In order, as we take care of our parents here, we do it from godliness. Now, this word, this particular word for godliness is only used 2 times in the New Testament. Kind of a strange word. It's used as a noun in other places. It's used as an adjective in other places, but it's only used as a verb 2 times in the New Testament. And the other one I think we need to turn to in order to perhaps deepen our understanding of what it means to show godliness. In Acts chapter 17, you remember the particular setting here. Paul in Athens, he's in Greece. And as he's walking through the streets of Athens, he approaches the Areopagus, this huge amphitheater where there are orators and lots of speakers. And as he was walking down the streets, there were these little recessed in the wall, these little statues with inscriptions. And this was the name of the god. And as he approached the Areopagus, he saw all these different little g gods along the way. But he arrived at one that caught his attention. It was the inscription to the unknown God. Because they thought, God forbid that we ever, little g God, forbid that we forget one God and he get angry with us. So we're putting one in there to cover all of our bases, right? The unknown God. So that's where Paul begins. In Acts chapter 17, look at what it says here. For as I passed and observed the objects, verse 23, of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Now again, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4, we're talking about showing godliness. That's what's on our mind. The same verb for showing godliness here is translated as what therefore you worship. Worshiping. What you worship as unknown, which kind of deepens our understanding of what it means to show godliness to our mamas. It's almost to the extent of worshiping them. Now, we don't go that far, do we? Because we know that we only worship God, but it's this devout dedication to our parents, where we are committed. Now, we understand when we talk about worship, if we back up from our parents and our relationship to them, when we think about our relationship to God, we understand that being a Christian is not this passive, I'll just be a Christian when I feel like it, or I'll be a Christian when it's convenient to me, or I'll be a Christian when it feels right. That's not Christianity in any respect, is it? So it is with our mamas. It's not when it's convenient, and it's not when we feel like it. It's a devotion. It's a commitment. It's an active pursuit of taking care of mom. Whenever she needs it, whatever she needs, I want to do that for her. That's what it means to take care of my mom, to show godliness. Now, intrinsic, obviously, in this particular word is the idea that it's pleasing to God, right? What you worship, and that's appropriate. We worship God. We're devoted to God. But in the same respect, it's pleasing to God to be devoted to our parents, to have this commitment to take care of our parents. It's godliness, showing godliness, being compassionate and caring, just the way that God is to us. Now, another time that this word is used as an adjective is in Acts chapter 10. And if you're familiar with the book of Acts, you're familiar with the story of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. You remember that particular story. Acts chapter 10 and verse 2, it describes him as a God-fearing and, our word, devout man. being committed to our parents when they need us. It's essential. It's devotion. It's being godly. Godliness. This is an appropriate response to our parents, our mothers, when they are in need. Now, the second aspect of an approved care of our parents is this idea of giving. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household. And to make some return to their parents is giving. It's giving back to our parents. The word apa, which means from or away from, depending on its context. And the second word, didomi, which means to give. So you have this idea of giving away from, or apa sometimes every once in a while will mean back. Or so it literally means to give back. Or to hand it away. I take it from me and I give it to my mom because I care for her. Now, the other word, the other aspect of giving back or to give away is make some return. Make a return. You ever been to the store and made a return? Or in this day and age, you ever bought something from Amazon and said, nah, I'm going to return that, right? They give it to you, and guess what? You give it right back. I'm not interested. But in this case, this word in other places is used as a recompense or repayment. Recompense, perhaps a little negative connotation. Repayment, a little bit better. But the concept is used throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, we're familiar with the concept of their legal interactions with one another. The concept was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, blow for blow, life for life. It's that same concept. We might put it in a term that we are a little more familiar with. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Guess what? Your mother has been scratching your back for a long time. Now it's time to turn around and scratch her back. It's giving back. You have the ability. It is within you. She has given so much to you. Now it's time to make some return. It's to give back to mom because she has paid you. So what you do in some small and insignificant way, we pay her back for all that she's done for us. After all, she gave you life. That's pretty good. We give back. We make some return, some small return back to mom. So we give. We show godliness to her, approved ways of taking care of mom. And this third aspect of approved care of mom is that God sees it. Because that's the end of verse 4. Let them first learn to show godliness, which is interesting because showing godliness, that's not a natural instinct, but we learn it, we develop it. Learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents because God sees it. Because this is pleasing in the sight of God. Isn't that interesting? You ever think about how God sees it? I think more times than not, we understand and we see as people who are in that situation and they are in the position of taking care of mom right now, providing for her. We understand, we think more often about what my siblings aren't doing. my commitment to them, and then how much nobody sees, nobody cares, nobody appreciates. And even mom, every once in a while, she gets grumpy with me. Mom, I'm giving you so much. Look at the end again. What we do, it pleases God. And we can't lose sight of that. Because when we think that we're just trying to please mom or please our brothers and sisters, we will get grumpy. We'll get aggravated. But when we remember that our actions are pleasing God, that we're in some small way that we are doing this for God, we have a much better attitude about it, don't we? That this is approved in the sight of God. Which, when you think about this, is that there are things in life that we do that God approves of. But on the flip side, there are things perhaps that we do and God disapproves of. But God sees both of them, doesn't he? Which reminds us of a passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, you remember? We must all stand before the judgment seat of God, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. We're going to stand before God. We're going to give an answer to him for everything that we've done. And we better make sure that it is good, that we are doing what is right and taking care of your mama. Well, God appreciates that. It's pleasing to God. Now consider the disapproved behavior of taking care of mom. Found here at verse 8. This is what is not okay. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Consider, first of all, that the disapproval begins with not providing. Someone who does not provide. This word, compound, first one is pros, which means before, beforehand, to, towards. And the other one is to consider or to think. When combined, we arrive at this word, which literally would mean to think beforehand. So when we think about providing for mom, we're not necessarily thinking about grabbing some Wendy's on the way home from work just because I was close. That is, in one small way, providing, right? Providing for your parents. But we are thinking about careful consideration before we get to that point. We're thinking about forethought. We're talking about some pre-planning that is necessary. If someone does not make provision, not necessarily just in the moment, they have forethought. They've given a lot of thought to how we're going to take care of mom, how we ought to take care of mom, what she needs, considering her. But you notice here after this, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, look at this progression. Provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household. And here we could take that even a step further, couldn't we? In this context, we're talking about providing for your parents, right? So if we continue the progression, if you don't provide for your relatives, that's not good. If you don't provide for people in your house, that's even worse. But if you don't even provide for your parents that have given you so much, good grief, that's terrible. How bad? How awful? If you don't even have enough love in your heart to take care of mom, where is your heart? And you begin to wonder, do you even have a heart? If you don't do this, in verse 8, the thought continues that if you do not provide for your relatives, Here's twofold consequences. You have, first of all, denied the faith. The second is that you are worse than an unbeliever. But consider denying the faith. Would you think, or even begin to consider that if you don't take care of those who are in need, especially in your own house, that it's the equivalent of denying your faith? Now, this is the same word used in Matthew chapter 26. You remember Peter standing around the fire. And they accused him. You were with him 3 times. Your accent betrays you. Your speech. He denied Jesus 3 times. Same word. When we don't take care of our parents, when we don't take care of our family, it's like we've denied Jesus all over again. Do you see the gravity of that? It's very important. Now, obviously, you're reading verse 8. And you're thinking in your mind, how is that denying the faith? Listen to me. Verse 8 has absolutely nothing, 100% zip, zilch, nada to do with the 1-hour worship service, does it? Has nothing to do with how we worship God, which tells me what you do outside of worship matters. It tells me that in order to be a Christian, you better act like a Christian. It tells me that we can come and we can worship God and we can sit in the pew and warm up our spot. But if we're not living it, it doesn't mean a thing. If you're not acting, if you're not doing right, you have denied the faith, just like Peter, denying the faith. And you're worse. The second part is that you're worse than an unbeliever. Or we might say it another way. It would be better if you weren't a believer. That hurts a little bit, doesn't it? You're worse than an unbeliever. The word has the alpha privative, which negates the word that follows, and the word is faith, pistis. Lack faith. You're worse than those who disbelieve, those who have no faith, or we might say the faithless. You're worse than the agnostic. You're worse than the atheist, the one that doesn't even believe that there is a God. Boy, oh boy, the way that we take care of our parents when they need us, it matters, and it matters to God. We understand what Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 says, don't we? Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For you got to believe that he exists before you can approach him. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. So if my actions negate my faith or negate what I believe, I can't please God. And as a consequence of that, I can't be with him. I hope you understand the gravity of what it means to take care of mom, to be devoted to caring for those relatives that need us, our parents especially. Boy, oh boy. I don't know about you, but I desperately want to get to heaven. And if I've learned anything from this passage, in a broad general overview, we're flying at 1,000 feet. I understand that how I act and how I care for others perhaps even will determine where I spend eternity. So as we close, where will you spend eternity? Are your actions congruent? Are they parallel with where you're going to spend eternity? If they're not, let's get it right. If you need to get right with God, come forward as we stand and as we sing.